Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for attending today's event. My name's Lucy. I'm the events coordinator at the Staffordshire Chambers. Today we've got Tom and Andrew doing their presentation on effective fundraising for businesses. I'll hand over to Andrew.
Okay, well, hello everybody. We've got about 20 minutes, half an hour session, something like that, and then time for some questions if you've got any afterwards. I'm going to deliver the first bit, and then Tom is going to carry on and do the second bit of it. So I'll quickly show you the agenda that we've got planned for you. So we're going to tell you a very little bit about ourselves, just to give a bit of background. We're going to have a bit of a conversation about different strategies for fundraising, which is quite important. And then we're going to get into some stuff around bidding for grants, which is where my specialism comes. And then Tom's going to talk a little bit more about that, but predominantly around debt finance options. And then after that, we're going to have a chance for some questions. So if you're happy, we're going to move on straight into it. So I'll tell you a bit about myself first. So I had a very long public sector career before I set up my business back in 2017. And a very big part of my work, both before I left the public sector, but also since, is really involved in securing external funding for projects. To the extent that up until today, I've raised roughly £37.5 million worth of funding for a massive variety of externally funded schemes, from leisure centres to steam railways to sexual health charities and everything in between. So quite diverse stuff. My background is predominantly grants, sponsorship, crowdfunding and social investment. And I'm a member of the Institute of Fundraising, and I'm also registered with the fundraising regulator, so try and run a pretty ethical business. Finally, I guess the last thing to say is I'm based in Stoke-on-Trent over in Longton, so hopefully fairly local to a lot of people. Tom, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. So my name's Tom Wilkinson. I'm Managing Director of a company called Beta Commercial Finance. What we principally do is consult with businesses to help them get debt finance solutions. So these are your typical loans, working capital solutions, and property-related transactions. So what we essentially do is understand the clients and then match them with the most appropriate funder based upon those needs. The business has been going since 2016. We're based in Alton, Staffordshire Moor. So if anyone knows where Alton Towers is, it's in the village there. And also in my spare time on a not-for-profit basis, I'm also the director and chair of a community-owned pub called the White Hart.
Oh,
Very diverse stuff there. So we'll carry on. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is your strategy for fundraising stuff. And that starts really with your legal structure. And it has a massive, massive bearing on the funding you can access, particularly in the world of grants and the scope of that. Probably the only exception to that is the world of debt finance, which almost reverses this table. So the bottom line is, if you talk about grant funding, as a for-profit business, sole trader, limited company, your access to grant funding is fairly limited. It's not non-existent by any stretch, but it'll typically be for things that create jobs, that increase economic output. And you'll be talking to people like the Growth Hub and the Skills Hub and the Chamber. And there'll be a lot of debt finance options there with people like Tom involved. If you are some kind of community organisation, then unregistered charities, i.e. charities with an income of less than £5,000, or an unincorporated group like a residents association, have some access to funds. Your local football team will have some access to funds and grants. When it starts getting really interesting is when you start talking about social enterprise. Obviously, social enterprises blend the benefits of charity and a commercial business, and they sit somewhere in the middle. And they have reasonably good access to grant funding from the sort of social sphere. And then your gold standard for access to funding from the social sphere would be a registered charity, anything with a charity number. And you've got underneath that on my chart, on my infographic here, you've got a charitable incorporated organisation, which is effectively very, very similar to a charity, with some slightly different rules. So if you're looking at grants from trusts and foundations and those sort of places, they're the organisational structures that they really want to fund. So legal structure has a huge bearing on your ability to secure funding, but it depends not only on the kinds of funding, it's matching the right kind of funding to the right kind of structure is the vital bit.
Andrew, can I just, sorry, we can't see the slides. It's an internet picture.
Oh, that's weird, because we're sharing. Let's try sharing again. Glad you said that. I will reshare.
Perfect, thank you.
That's weird. Wonder why that's happened, because it was working fine a minute ago. Have you got slides now?
Perfect, yeah, we can see them.
Right, let's just go back to where, I'll go back to the beginning quickly. So that's the slide that gives us the agenda for today. I've talked through it quickly, so I'm going to spin straight on. Then you've got a little bit about Tom and myself. Those who've been listening for the last few minutes, you've had a bit of an introduction from us. And then we get on to what I've just been talking about, which is legal structure and grants. And the key point of this is that your legal structure has a big, big bearing on the grants and funding you can access. Ultimately, for-profit businesses will have much better access to loans and debt-based finance, and some access to grants, but quite limited, quite specialist. Whereas anything that's charitable at the other end of that diagram will have very, very good access to grants, but will have some access to debt finance, usually through something called social investment, which is a sort of subset of the world Tom operates in. I'll move on from there because I'm conscious we need to move along. So let's talk about finding grants. This is actually a massive, massive question because there is no one place to look. It's actually incredibly difficult. If you just jump onto Google and put a search in for who you are and what you do in your location or your sector, you'll get all sorts of results, most of which won't be very helpful. So places I'd suggest talking to, certainly for businesses, chat to the Chamber, chat to the Growth Hub. They've got a pretty good hand on local funding. There are some very useful websites. So the top one on that list of websites is a government website about business finance and will lead you into all sorts of quite interesting things. Often you'll find a lot of funding from places like Innovate UK showing on that particular list. So that's quite a good one, certainly for businesses. For the middle one, Grants Online, is a grant funding database, which actually covers both for-profit and not-for-profit. So that's quite an interesting one. There is a subscription fee for that, but it's not big money. So that's quite an interesting place to look for funding opportunity. And then finally, My Funding Central, which is only just relaunched in the last couple of weeks, is probably, to my mind, the best of the funding databases for the not-for-profit world, and one I would absolutely recommend. Although, like all of these things, remember, any database search, which is what these are, it's a question of garbage in, garbage out. So really think carefully about your search terms. And if you're not confident with those, get some help, because otherwise you'll end up with all sorts of very, very spurious results. And it's not unusual to put a search in and get 500 or 600 hits, which actually is far too much information because you then can't make sense of it. So you've really got to think carefully about how you do searches. The reality of grant funding is that the matching of grants to your organisation is the #1 thing that will make the biggest difference to your success. I cannot tell you how many people I talk to in a year who tell me they've applied for this, they've applied for that, and I sit and think that they're really upset because they haven't been successful. And I have a conversation with them and I quickly work out that they probably shouldn't have bothered in the first place. All they've really done is wasted their time. So really think carefully about the matching. Think about the eligibility criteria especially. This is just like a job application. If you don't meet the person's specification, the grantor's eligibility criteria, please just don't bother applying because you won't be successful. It's a competitive world and everything has to be right. And if it's not right, then you're probably wasting your time. Really think also about the match funding. Now, in Tom's world, they'll talk about this as intervention rates, X percentage of the money, but it's match funding, same thing. It's basically how much money you as the applicant are able to put into the project. Now, in some cases, certainly in the not-for-profit world, that can be done with in-kind contributions, so people's time and things like that. In the business world, it's pretty much always hard cash. And be aware that sometimes there's a way of working that where you can perhaps match 2 grants against each other to reduce the amount you need to put in. So one funder may say, we will fund 50% of the project. That doesn't necessarily mean you've got to fund the other 50% yourself. You might find a situation where you have 50% from one funder, 40% from another, and you've only put 10% in. Obviously, the more funders you get into a project, the more complicated it gets and the bigger your chances of problems arise. But, I've successfully delivered projects with up to 11 funders involved. Don't get me wrong, it can be hell on earth, but it can be made to work and you can get really big projects delivered that way. So think about your match funding. It's really important. And really the number one message in terms of grants is if you don't fit, just don't apply. Don't waste your time. It's like applying for a job you're not qualified for. You're not going to get an interview. So let's give you a few general tips for effective bid writing. And there's no one set of list here. Everybody's got a slightly different view on this. But this is certainly my thoughts. So carefully review the eligibility criteria and the funder's objectives. The objectives bit is really important here. So often I find people who write grant applications that are all about them and their organisation. And what they're missing is a vital point. And that's that every single funder in the UK, just on trusts and foundations, we've got 8,800 giving out grants. So there's an awful lot of organisations involved. Every single funder exists to achieve something. And if you don't understand what they're trying to achieve, how are you going to get any chance at all of getting hold of their money? What you've got to do is you've got to explain your needs in terms of how they deliver their outcomes and their desires, rather than tell a lovely story about how wonderful you are and how much, you know, their funding is going to make a difference to your work. That's part of the story, but it's not the important bit. Wherever possible, try and speak to a funder before you start an application. There's nothing like a conversation with them. Not only will it help make sure you're not wasting your time, it'll also build a relationship, begin to build their understanding of who you are and what you're about. And the more dialogue you can have with them, the better, in my view. Sometimes that can be really difficult. Not every funder will talk to you, but always try. It's a great place to start before you waste a whole load of time and effort. Explain how your project delivers their desired outcomes. I've touched on that already, so we'll move on. Think that bidding is going to be very, very competitive, and it is. In terms of sort of social funding, I can tell you that before COVID came along, 1 in 12 was the average success rate for funders. Since COVID's come along, funders are telling us things like, 4%. Yeah, I mean, 4%, that's a horrendous strike rate. Although be aware, it's not as bad as it sounds, because that includes all of those junk applications that should never have been submitted in the first place. So if you put a decent application, you're going to leapfrog all of those. But even so, the point is it's deeply competitive. So quality matters. You've got to make sure you demonstrate your credibility. Show the funder that you're a trustworthy organisation, you're a credible organisation. If you're a brand new organisation and you've just formed, you've just registered your CIC or you've just registered your company and you apply for a grant, if you're applying for a fairly chunky grant, you've got to make your own real uphill battle at that point because you've got no credibility to show. You've got no registered accounts, none of that stuff. The more established your organisation is, the better your chance of success. And if you're a very young organisation, then keep on the small grants. Don't go for the big fish to begin with, because you will have a better chance of success on the smaller grants. And then think about value for money. That sounds blatantly obvious, but again, I hear lots of people saying, oh, it's a grant. It's other people's money. We can have the best possible items we want. Oh, how do we get the most out of this grant? Oh, they'll fund £20,000. Okay, how do I make my grant up to £20,000? Don't do it. It's a fast road to failure. What you should do is build your application on the best items that offer value, not top of the line, what's going to do the job. They don't want, the funders don't want to fund rubbish, but they also don't want to pay over the odds on the Mercedes-Benz version. Yeah. So think about that. And also they will sniff out a grant that's been built on the idea that, oh, we'll try and get the maximum money they're able to offer. Instead, and that'll be a failure. So instead, don't do that. Build your budget based on what it is you actually need. And if you're only applying for half of the money available, only apply for half, because better to have the half than nothing at all. Okay, really important principles here. You also need to think a bit about sustainability. A lot of grants will ask you a really difficult question. How are you going to sustain this after the grant money is spent? And that's a tremendously difficult question to answer, but it's something you're going to have to give some thought to. You might need to do some business planning. You might need to think about actually what this project is. Are you using the grant to try and sustain yourself, or are you using the grant to actually pilot an idea? And that may have some bearing on how you develop your project, because that sustainability question can be really important. Write concisely. You don't need to write in, perfect written English. I use a lot of abbreviations. I try and explain them first, but I always use them. Use ampersands rather than ands if you've got word counts and character counts. Think about things like that make your application must be intelligent, well written and clear, but it doesn't have to follow perfect grammar, because perfect grammar can cost you words, the space you just don't have on these applications. Because you will find you get word and character counts, and they can be a real challenge. I often rewrite the same answer to a question 10 or 12 times before I get it the way I really want it. And it's worth putting that time and effort in. Don't send information that's not required. If they haven't asked for it, they don't want to look at it. And by sending them too much information, A, they're going to ignore it, and B, you might end up hiding something that was more important. So just don't think, oh, that's interesting, I'll send them that. It's pointless. And finally, your deadlines are just that. They are absolutely immutable in most cases. So if there's a deadline, comply with it. Some of these funders, if you are 30 seconds after the deadline, then you disregard it. So really think carefully about deadlines, because that's tremendously important. This is a quick insight into a black box that people don't really understand. What this infographic shows is, roughly speaking, it's a model of what happens after you submit your bid. And people don't get this stuff, and it's really important. So this model assumes that the funder has £100,000 to allocate in any one round of funding. They probably receive at least £1 million worth of applications. So if you start from the left, there's £1 million of applications land on the funder's desk. Now, for anybody who has ever been involved in recruiting jobs, there's a very similar process when you get the application forms land on your desk. What's the first thing you do? Well, you're going to go through it, you're going to look for reasons to exclude people because you've got far too much information than you can really handle. And funders are the same. So what they're going to do, they're going to go through and they're going to look for incomplete applications, applications that don't meet their outcomes, applications that are just generally very poorly done. And they're going to disregard those out of hand because they're only really interested in looking at the good ones. So that's your first hurdle. The second hurdle, you're probably down to half the original applications that went in, but they're still, it's still a 5-to-1 outcome. So it's still not great odds. So what happens then is somebody in that funding organisation is going to look at all those applications and they're going to summarise them. And what they're going to do, they're going to summarise them in a way that, can go to a board, because your application form could be 20 pages, could be more. And the board is never going to read 50, 20-page documents. So somebody somewhere is going to summarise that down to probably 2 sides of A4. Now you're losing control at that point because it's going from your words into their words. And there's a few tips and tricks you can do to help with that in terms of how you structure information, use bullet points, make the key points really easy to find in your application. But be aware that at that point, you lose control. And as a result, it's much more difficult to influence. And then finally, what happens after that summarised document is issued to the members of the board, they're then going to sit down at home probably and read all these application packs they've got, this information they've got. And they're going to think about what are their favourites and what are the ones they like as individuals. And then in the old world, they'd have sat around a board table to make those decisions. And they've still got 500,000 applications to look at there. Maybe dropped a little bit, maybe they're down to 250,000 even. But they've still got more than they can fund. So what's going to happen in that final stage, and this is the really difficult bit for every grant, is that they're going to sit down and they're going to think, well, how do we decide between these 25 applications or whatever it happens to be, and we can only fund 10 of them? How are we going to decide which ones we want to fund? And at this stage, they're all really strong applications. They're all really good. And they could be quite diverse. They could be from very different businesses or from very different not-for-profit organisations. And making an objective comparison between them is difficult, or nigh on impossible in my view. So you can get caught in all sorts of strange decision-making at this stage. So it might be that you've put a really good application in, but actually in the last round the funder did, they funded 5 other applications just like yours. Well, that's not good because your odds go through the floor at that point. They might also have done 5 other applications from your location and they want to spread the money more widely. That can happen. So there's a whole load of things go on. The other thing that will happen in that group is you'll get things like horse trading going on in the group. You'll get a whole load of things that really aren't objective, they're very subjective decision making. These are my favourites. I'll tell you what, I'll support yours if you support mine. Those sort of conversations. All this happens in the real world. So the simple truth about grants is the key is to put a really strong bid in, which gets you into that final bundle. Yeah, but once you're into that final bundle, you're into that final assessment, it becomes a fairly random process. And anybody who ever says they'll guarantee you success, they are lying to you, because no one can, in my view. And it's important you understand that. And it's also important, if you write your own applications, that you don't get disheartened when you get a rejection. Because it may be that it was a perfectly fine application. It was just unlucky. And that happens. It happens a lot. So I'm almost finished with my slides, but I wanted to quickly talk to you about using people like me, consultants, people like me and Tom, I guess. We can add capacity, which is a huge value sometimes. Some of these applications take a lot of work. We can add expertise, and we can help with scale. As I've just said, please don't trust people who guarantee success. There's a lot of sharp practice out there, and I wouldn't want you to fall foul of it. Consultants, in the end, can only ever increase your chances of success. That's our job. Our job is to interrogate you and present your information as well as we can. Anybody who offers no win, no fee, I'm somewhat skeptical of, maybe slightly different in Tom's space, but certainly in the space I work, it's considered to be a fairly dubious approach. And you'll often pay over the odds by doing that route. One of the problems is that it can encourage minimum effort. And you'll find people want to bang in as many applications as they can and just play a numbers game. That's not good for you as the client. It's important for you to be aware that very few funders these days will include consultants' fees within the grant value. So you need to have that money separately anyway. And please don't, I hear people say this occasionally, they say things like, don't worry, we'll hide your fees in the builder's costs, or we'll hide your fees in the architect's bit, or something like that. That's basically just fraud. So please don't engage in that as a way of covering costs. It's a really bad idea. And at that point, I'm going to pass over to Tom.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. So as I mentioned, everyone, my name is Tom Wilkinson from Beta Commercial Finance. And first of all, I'm going to talk us through a little bit about startup loans, something that's very common, particularly at the moment with individuals setting up their own businesses. I'll talk a little bit about business grants and some resources to access those. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit more about debt finance, which is where we principally help our clients. So starting with the Startup Loans Company, this is a government-backed lender that essentially provides funding to businesses who are just starting the market. So you need to be very much a new business or trading within less than 2 years. The structure is the same for everyone. You can access £500 to £25,000 per person per company. So if there's a limited company with 2 directors, you could access up to £50,000. Essentially, it's a personal loan for business purposes. So the funds are issued to you personally because it is very much based on your own credit checks, but they must be used for the purpose of what that business or enterprise is looking to do with those funds. So very much it's based on a good credit profile. So individuals that have shown they can manage their own finances and pay back previous finance facilities. Very much need to be experienced in the trade that you're looking to go in. So very often we see individuals leaving perhaps a role at a larger company to set up on their own. And you need to show a clear requirement for the funds of which you're applying. The Startup Loans Company are very good in their support. They offer free templates for you to develop a cash flow forecast, a business plan, and a personal survival budget. That support is free, and there are no setup costs with the Startup Loans Company. It's a fixed rate of 6% interest for everyone. Again, it's not based upon who you are and what you're doing. It's the same for every applicant. The terms are 1 to 5 years. And as I say, you do need to be a startup company or trading less than 2 years. Now, it's important to be aware there are other funding, debt finance particularly out there for startup businesses, but this is very much the best route from a cost point of view to go down. And as I say, there's other enterprises that the Startup Loans Company work through, but if anyone is looking for startup funding on a debt finance point of view, this is the best place to start. Thanks, Andrew. So moving on to business grant funding and the support that's available, very much as Andrew's elaborated on with applying for grants, there's a huge overlap in looking at businesses and the grant funding that's available to those. So grants are there to provide some kind of benefit, and you need to focus on what that benefit is. So it could be an economic benefit, it could be something specific to an industry, to increase employment within the local area, or to develop the skills and the training of individuals within those companies. So when you look at the grants, make sure you are ticking the boxes for what that grant is there to provide. Very much they are locally based, so you will see that grants, even though they're on a national basis, will be specific to the local area, again, because they are trying to provide some economic benefit to businesses and individuals within that local area. We talk about intervention rates, and this is something just to consider. If there's a grant available, say up to £1,000, that it might be for 60% of the funding of which you're going for. These intervention rates can change, but bear in mind you will be then asked to put in the remaining contribution. So some can go up to 100%, but some might start at 25%. So for ease of figures, if you're looking at a grant of a project up to £1,000, then if it's a 25% intervention rate, they will be providing £250. If it's 60%, they'll be providing £600. So you need to think about where your contribution is coming to. The other thing to be mindful of is business to business or business to consumer. So this is looking at who your end customer is. Many businesses operate purely to other businesses. Others operate purely to the direct consumer, and some have a mix between the two. Again, very much there is a consideration about what makes up your client base. So make sure that you, when you look at the grants that apply to you, that you tick the thresholds for what type of concentration you need to have. Use of the finance, be very specific about what you're using those funds for. Very often those grants will only have specific requirements for the purpose of those funds. So again, make sure that you do tick those requirements. When you go out and purchase assets with the grant funding, or for whatever the use is, very often you need to get free quotes. It can be quite an extensive exercise, so just be mindful that that is very important to the grant providers, because again, it's showing that you've gone out and you've been fair in terms of the providers that are going to provide the service for the purpose of your grant, and they do ask for documentary evidence to show that as well. Managing cash flow, something that can often catch people out is that if you get a grant that's been agreed, you do need to expend the spend yourself first before you can claim that grant back. So they don't issue the funds for you to then utilise to spend. You have to make that spend, show that you've actually purchased the items that has been agreed in the grant, and then claim that money back. So sometimes from a cash flow point of view, it can catch people out, and you just need to make sure you've got those funds that you have to use before you claim back the grants. Final point there is many people ask, can we apply for multiple grants? And the answer is yes. Very much the business grant funding has been European funding, and that may change now going forward given everything that's happening with Europe. But again, they have a regulation called de minimis, and it just means that there's a certain threshold over a period of time which you can't reach in terms of the grant funding that you've had. So as long as you don't go over this threshold, which has historically been €200,000, then you can apply for multiple grants either at the same time or over a number of years. Next slide, please, Andrew. So just looking at local resources, whenever a client comes to me and says, we're looking at grants, is there any grants that we might be eligible for? These 5 sources are principally where I will send them to have a look in to what grants might be available. And sometimes we'll obviously help them and direct them to those. It's important to remember we don't facilitate grant applications. We merely point our clients in the right direction, because often they can sit alongside any debt finance where you've taken out funds that you would need to pay back. So the Chamber of Commerce, a very good source of support. There's a gentleman there called Matthew Hustwit, and he is the growth enabler for the local area, and you can find out his contacts on the website. Very, very good individual to talk about for any grant funding that might be eligible to you. There's also the Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire Local Enterprise. They enable grant funding as well as other support and resources for you to take forward. Make It Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire, and also the Staffordshire County Council. Again, very localised areas for you to have a look. Now, I would encourage you to go onto these links because it will direct you to where you can actually find the support and help for these specific grants. They provide a lot of detail to show whether you may or may not be eligible, and also offer the support in terms of contact and eligibility criteria and the application form, so that you can see if you're eligible for that. The final one is the Business Innovation Centre. And again, these are all very much for Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire. So just be mindful, if you are in a different council area, there is probably another local council body, but if you scour their website, I'm sure you'll find the area upon which they offer business and finance support and grant funding.
Tom, can I just add one extra thing there? And that's also look at your local universities. In the local area, Keele and Staffs are brilliant for knowledge transfer partnerships, which is another way of accessing European money through the universities to support your organisation. Usually around innovation ideas, but quite interesting opportunities there. Shall I move on for you, Tom?
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. So debt finance, this is essentially where you are borrowing money that you will have to pay back over a period of time. And this is principally what we at Beta Commercial Finance help our clients to do. So you will all know of the big 6 banks, which are still in operation, but have changed very much so over the last few years. And what I've done there is I've put some other lenders below that are now in the market, and there are hundreds of these different type of lenders. The British Business Bank is a government-owned bank, which are set up to help businesses as much as possibly. And again, that funding comes directly from the government as opposed to the usual banking lending streams. Startup Loans Company we've already spoke about. Seeders and Crowdcube, this is ways to raise funding through equity. So you would potentially be a high growth startup, and these websites would help you raise money for investors that want to take a share in your company. Again, we've got what we call a challenger bank market now, where there's other lenders that come in to offer what the high street banks used to offer and can be very much more competitive on price. Handelsbank and Atom Bank are two that are very prevalent in the market. Funding Circle, which many of you may have heard from, this is what we call a peer-to-peer lender. So their funding actually comes from individuals that go onto the platform and invest their own money. The interest rate that is then matched against the credit risk profile of the business is the interest rate that those personal investors receive back as income from their putting their money into the platform. Again, it's a very quick way for businesses to borrow money, and these loans and facilities can happen often in a matter of days. Another area of the market is digital banks. Banks which don't have a high street presence at all. It's all online, and Starling Bank again is one of the most prevalent entities in this market now. So they provide current accounts and they also provide lending to their clients. So the purpose of this slide is just to show you that outside the banks there is a lot of different type of lending options. Thanks, Andrew. And the last slide is just to explain a little bit more about this debt finance and how it's moved forward. So we had the big 6 UK banks. After the banking crisis in September 2008, the nature of lending became very restricted. So it opened the market for alternative finance. Banks would often reduce the risk profile of who they could support, and they've now taken that further to reduce costs and face-to-face contact, which has led people to go online or to source other alternative finance. So what's essentially happened is you've had a new challenger environment. So there's much more options now on the market, not only to compete with the high street banks, but also to provide funding options that they couldn't do previously. As I mentioned, peer-to-peer finance is very prevalent at the moment. The Funding Circle, who are one of the biggest lenders now in the UK, I don't know if anyone was aware of the coronavirus business interruption loans, but they are actually the 3rd biggest provider, including the high street banks, for those loans over the last 16 months. So it just shows how much that market has grown to give you other options of how you obtain finance. A lot of these banks are now digital, so we have fintech lenders, and that would mean that very much instead of meeting with a bank manager as someone might have done years ago, you can apply on online portals, put in information about your business and the individuals. They will credit profile that business, analyze that information very quickly, and issue funds sometimes on the same day of which an agreement has been reached. There's a lot of new finance products out there, so typically banks would issue overdrafts and loans. There's all sorts of amalgamations on these now, things such as revolving credit facilities or facilities that are lent against card sales if you're that type of business. And again, these fit more the requirements of what actual needs are there for people that are looking to borrow money. So it's navigating these options, which is where we help our clients. So we really understand what the business is, what they actually do, what they're looking to do, and what they're looking to achieve from their finance products. We then match that up with the most appropriate solution and facilitate that for them from start to finish. And that's it. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Tom. So final slide from us before we have some questions is just, these are our contact details. I know I'd be delighted to talk to anybody who wants to chat, and I'm sure Tom would be the same. So any questions? Shall I drop the slide?
Yes, let's have a look. Let me just put this down first. I'm not quite sure whether I've unmuted myself.
You have?
I have I? That's great. Hi, everybody. I'm Ivy, and I'm actually in the members' lounge of the chambers right now because it was the easiest place for me to come to, and it's lovely here. I'm glad it's all sort of opened up now. I was just wondering whether or not in this day and age, whether or not sponsorship and corporates, the responsibility of bigger corporates are still sort of in a healthy state, or are they sort of backing out more now in terms of what they would support?
I mean, we've actually got a separate session planned for sponsorship. It's a really interesting area. I think it's a couple of weeks' time. You check the Chamber's list for that. But what I would say very quickly is that there is definitely sponsorship opportunities out there. It is incredibly challenging. Sponsorship has always been incredibly challenging and will remain that way. There is an art to it, but if you're going to go chasing sponsorship, just expect to spend a lot of time beating your head against the wall before you get the result you want. It's hard work, but and like a lot of things, if you do it badly, your chances of success are next to nil. So you've got it. Quality really matters in the world of sponsorship. CSR and sponsorship are often confused. The simple reality is sponsorship should be a commercial transaction, whereas CSR isn't necessarily quite so commercial. So when you're thinking about sponsorship, what you've got to think about is what have you got that your sponsor might want? Yeah, what's the commercial value for them? It's a bit like this thing about matching the outcomes for a grant funder. If you want to chat about this stuff, Ivy, I'd be delighted to have a chat on a separate occasion.
Yeah, that's great. It's certainly an area that I'm interested in because I'm working with a lot of charities and arts-based organisations now, and there's various things that each organisation offers. It's about talking to the right sponsors, really, to the right companies that would then we can add value to what they do as well.
About how you go about it, I think, is the fundamental message there. Anything else?
Thank you. This is frozen right now. Hang on a minute.
Moving from my perspective, it's all been deeply quiet. So we've either confused you, answered all your questions, or you're just scared of us. Hopefully it's none of those.
No, I've answered a lot of the questions, and it'd be good if we can get this link sent over so we can access the information, so that we can find further information out.
No problem.
Yeah, and I was only coming on to spy to see what else was available, sort of at the lower end of the market, grants, all those kind of things. So I thought, well, I'll hop on. It's useful to know because when people come to me and I can't help them, where can I point them? And obviously, throwing in that Tom or you could help is really useful. But sometimes they'll ask you a question and you're thinking, I don't know. So it's useful to just have a rough idea.
Yeah, I mean, we all work in different sectors of the world. For me, I like working with small to medium, local to regional organisations, and I tend to work with not-for-profits. Tom will work, I think, more at the smaller end, but obviously in the commercial space. But I don't think it's that small necessarily, is it?
No, but it's very much, there is a lot of support in the local area, and as I say, when we send out these slides and the links available, please do have a look, because Stoke and Staffordshire particularly do try their very hardest to support local businesses and use those avenues. The thing with grants that you often find, particularly in the commercial sector, is that they don't always shout about them. That's not the local initiatives. These grants are often put out there, but you just need to keep checking those resources just to see that they're there and they're available. But if you speak to the local chamber, they will be more than happy to help you and direct you and give you guidance and advice to tap into those grants.
Oh, there is a strange irony in Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire, actually, particularly Stoke-on-Trent, in that the city's deprivation levels, which are extreme, we're one of the most deprived cities in the country, actually work in your favour in terms of funding applications because they open doors that many other people can't open. So whilst deprivation is a curse on the city, it can be an advantage for organisations that are applying for funding, particularly in the not-for-profit space.
Great.
Sorry, I've got a question.
Sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, I've got a question to ask. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for the presentation. I've been looking forward to hear more about funding for organization. I just want to ask, for consulting with you, does funding vary based on how many people are in the team or their skills, or it just varies on if the funding is targeting to the mission the company is about to fulfill? How will you answer that?
So I think I understand your questions. I think your question is, what basis will the amount of money you can access vary? And I think it's ultimately about what it is you're trying to achieve. There's two factors, two really big ones: how you're set up, what your legal structure is, and then what it is you're trying to achieve. They're the two really big factors, and geography has a significant bearing as well, certainly in my world. Tom, similar?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the grants, they're all very different. So some might say that at the very employment base, so if you're looking to take on 3 employees, they might have a return of, say, £8,000 per full-time equivalent. So naturally, that grant, the maximum you're going to be able to apply for is 24,000 within their thresholds. But then they also have the intervention rates, and they do all differ very much so. So principally, I always advise my clients to look at what you're trying to achieve and what will the outputs be from that achievement. We can then look at where you might fit with the available grants and the eligibility checklist and start seeing which ones that you may or may not be able to apply for.
It's very, very hard in the world of grants to give clear answers, because what you've got to remember is there are thousands of funders of one description or another, all interested in different things, all independent with their own rules, their own processes, and their own aims and objectives. And that makes the space incredibly complicated. And that's where really the voice of someone like Tom and myself and the support we can offer is valuable.
I'm just wondering.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Ivy.
Another question that I'm thinking about now, in terms of if you were to have 2 funding applications on the go, and you've not won neither of them just yet, would you be able to say that there's in-kind support from one funding matching the other?
Yeah, I mean, that's matching funders is always complicated. Yeah,
it's not confirmed, you see. So
no, absolutely. You can do, and it's nearly always the case, because no funder wants to be the first funder in most cases. Yeah. So you often find that you'll put an application into one funder and you'll talk about, and we've applied to this funder and to that funder and to that funder. Yeah. And you tell that story. Now, that's absolutely fine. And depends on how your budget's been built, if you're matching those funders against each other and that creates your total project cost, that's fine. And then your grant is potentially reliant on all of those applications being successful. Yeah. The other option is you end up with a situation where you apply for the same project to 2 or 3 different funders, not matching them against each other. Yeah. In which case that's still okay, because you've made an application, you haven't accepted the funding. The one thing you should never do is double fund a project, i.e. apply for the same project to multiple funders and then take the money from all of them. If you get an offer from more than one for the same piece of work, then you probably need to decide which one you want to accept and which one you want to reject, or try and renegotiate with one of them to say, actually, we've now got a grant from this funder for that piece of work, but would you support us for this?
Yeah, understood.
Just be very careful of kind of not doing anything fraudulent, basically. Any other questions? Okay, well, in which case I think we'll say thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you all. Hopefully you know where to find us, and we'd love to have a chat.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. Thank you so much. Learned a lot, actually. It's quite a lot to take in. Yeah. And yes, if we can have the links to your contacts and maybe the presentation slides, would that come out as well through an email?
Katie?
Yes. So I'll be sending across a link once it's all been recorded and edited. That'll be on the website, so I'll get that across to everyone, and the presentation, if that's okay with you, Andrew and Tom, with any useful links.
Yeah,
perfect. I'll get that sent straight across to everyone.
Lovely.
That's great. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.